The United States is no longer trying to manage the world order. It is trying to stop the collapse of its dominance before the rest of the world realizes the balance of power has already shifted. And if you understand that single point, then suddenly everything happening right now, the war in Ukraine, the pressure campaign against China, the attacks on Iran, the militarization of Asia, the economic warfare, the sanctions, the destruction of energy corridors, the chaos in the Middle East, all of it begins to make perfect strategic sense. Because this is not about democracy. It is not about human rights. It is not about peace. This is the final phase of a global struggle over who controls the future international order. And make no mistake, because what we are witnessing now is not simply another geopolitical rivalry. This is the most dangerous great power confrontation since the Cold War, except this time, the United States is entering the confrontation from a position of relative decline, not strength. And that changes everything. The American political establishment understands something that most ordinary people still do not fully grasp. China is rising faster than any rival power in modern history. Russia survived the largest sanctions regime ever attempted. Iran absorbed years of economic warfare and military pressure without collapsing. And perhaps most alarming for Washington, these three countries are no longer operating separately. They are increasingly coordinating strategically because they understand the exact same thing. If the United States succeeds in destroying one of them, the others become isolated and vulnerable next. That is the key to understanding this entire crisis. Washington never intended to coexist with multiple independent centers of power. The entire post-Cold War strategy of the United States was built around preserving primacy. Not balance, not coexistence, primacy. There's a massive difference between those concepts, and people need to understand it because the media deliberately confuses them. A balance of power system accepts that several strong nations will exist simultaneously, each constraining the ambitions of the others. But primacy means something entirely different. Primacy means one dominant power dictates the rules of the system itself. That was the American objective after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And for a brief moment in history, Washington believed it had achieved it permanently. Think back to the 1990s and early 2000s. American policymakers genuinely believed history had ended. The Soviet Union was gone. Russia was weak. China was still developing. Europe was subordinated through NATO and financial integration. The Middle East was under military pressure. The dollar dominated global finance completely. American corporations controlled global technology, and the Pentagon possessed overwhelming military superiority. This created a level of arrogance in Washington that became almost surreal. They believed no rival could ever emerge again. But here's the problem with empires throughout history. The very systems they create to expand their wealth eventually create the conditions for new competitors to rise. That's exactly what happened with China. The United States opened global markets, outsourced industrial production, integrated China into the world economy, and assumed Beijing would remain permanently dependent and subordinate. Instead, China used the system to build technological, industrial, and financial power on a scale the Americans never anticipated. And now, Washington is panicking. Because China is not simply another regional competitor. China represents the first country capable of challenging the United States economically, technologically, industrially, and geopolitically, all at the same time. That is unprecedented in the modern era. And if you stay with me, because this next part explains everything, you'll understand why the wars against Russia and Iran are directly connected to the confrontation with China itself. The United States understands it cannot isolate China alone. China is too large, too integrated into the global economy, and too strategically connected across Eurasia. So Washington developed a different strategy. Weaken every country capable of helping China resist American pressure. That includes Russia. That includes Iran. And eventually that includes any nation refusing to align with American strategic objectives. This is why the conflict in Ukraine matters far beyond Ukraine itself. Washington understood that a strong Russia connected economically to Europe and strategically to China represented a direct threat to long-term American dominance. Imagine the implications of a Eurasian economic zone stretching from Germany through Russia into China. Massive industrial capacity, energy integration, transportation corridors, independent financial systems, technological cooperation. That combination would fundamentally weaken American leverage over Europe and Asia simultaneously. The United States could never allow that to happen, and so NATO expansion became the mechanism for preventing Eurasian integration. People forget now, but after the Cold War, there were opportunities to build an inclusive European security structure involving Russia. Those opportunities were deliberately sabotaged because Washington did not want integration. It wanted dependency. There's a huge difference. NATO expansion was never fundamentally about defending Europe from invasion. It was about preserving American influence over Europe by preventing Europe from developing independent strategic relations with Moscow. That strategy worked for decades, but then China entered the equation. Suddenly, Russia no longer depended on Europe economically the way it once had. Energy exports shifted eastward. Trade corridors expanded across Asia. Financial alternatives emerged. And Washington realized something extremely dangerous was happening. Eurasia was slowly integrating despite American efforts to stop it. That's when the pressure campaigns intensified dramatically. And if you thought Ukraine was simply about territorial disputes, you completely missed the bigger picture. The war in Ukraine became an economic siege operation designed to weaken Russia strategically while simultaneously severing Europe from Russian energy permanently. That was the real objective. And look at what happened afterward. The Nord Stream pipelines were destroyed. Europe lost access to cheap Russian energy. Industrial competitiveness declined. American LNG exports suddenly became critical. European dependence on Washington increased again. This was not accidental. It was strategic restructuring. And now the exact same model is being applied against Asia. That's why the Middle East suddenly became so important again. Iran sits at the center of multiple strategic corridors connecting China westward across Eurasia. Iran is critical to energy flows, critical to transportation routes, critical to regional stability. If Washington destabilizes Iran, it disrupts Chinese connectivity across the broader region. Again, the target is larger than the individual country itself. Everything connects back to China. That's the part most analysts still fail to understand. The attacks on Iranian shipping, the militarization of maritime choke points, the pressure campaigns against Gulf states, the attempts to control strategic waterways. This is all part of a larger effort to constrain China's rise indirectly. Because Washington understands direct military confrontation with China would be catastrophic and unpredictable. So instead it seeks to weaken the broader geopolitical environment surrounding China itself. Now here's where things become truly dangerous. The United States is increasingly using instability itself as a strategic weapon. Think carefully about what we're seeing. Washington no longer behaves like a confident empire expanding stable systems. Instead, it increasingly behaves like a declining power trying to prevent alternative systems from emerging. That's a completely different psychology. Stable empires promote predictable trade routes, reliable financial systems, and controlled expansion. Declining empires often resort to disruption because they cannot maintain dominance through positive attraction anymore. That's exactly what we're seeing now. Economic warfare, sanctions, proxy conflicts, maritime destabilization, political destabilization, information warfare, financial coercion. All of these tools serve the same purpose: slowing the emergence of a multipolar system long enough for Washington to preserve leverage. But there's a fatal flaw in this strategy. The more pressure the United States applies, the more Russia, China, and Iran cooperate. That's the irony of the entire situation. Washington believed it could isolate these countries individually. Instead, American pressure accelerated strategic integration among them. Russia now exports more energy eastward than ever before. China increasingly develops financial systems outside Western control. Iran deepens security cooperation with both Moscow and Beijing. And across the global south, many countries are watching this process carefully while quietly diversifying away from American dependence. This is the part Western audiences rarely hear discussed honestly. Much of the world no longer views the United States as the guardian of global stability. Increasingly, countries view Washington as the primary source of instability itself. That perception shift is enormously important because empires ultimately survive on legitimacy as much as military power. Once legitimacy erodes, coercion becomes the primary mechanism maintaining influence. But coercion is expensive. It drains resources, it creates resistance, and eventually it accelerates decline. Now let's talk about Taiwan, because this issue reveals American strategy with remarkable clarity. Washington officially recognizes the One China policy publicly, while simultaneously undermining it militarily and politically behind the scenes. That contradiction is not confusion, it's strategy. The United States uses diplomacy not necessarily to resolve conflicts peacefully, but often to buy time, shape narratives, and position itself advantageously before escalation. We saw this with Russia before Ukraine. We saw it with Iran during negotiations, and we're seeing it now with China over Taiwan. Publicly, American leaders talk about stability. Privately, military integration across the Pacific intensifies continuously. Japan rearms. The Philippines expands military cooperation. South Korea integrates more deeply into American strategic planning. Naval deployments increase. Intelligence coordination expands. Weapons systems proliferate across the region. This is not de-escalation, it is preparation. And China sees. The moment Washington realized it could no longer stop the rise of China through economics alone, the entire strategy of the United States changed. And this is the part most people still fail to understand. What we are witnessing right now is not three separate crises involving Russia, Iran, and China. This is one integrated geopolitical war being fought across multiple fronts simultaneously. Ukraine is one front, the Middle East is another, Taiwan is another, the sanctions war is another, the attacks on global trade corridors are another. It is all connected. Every single piece of this puzzle leads back to one central objective: preserving American primacy before the balance of global power changes permanently. And if you think that sounds extreme, stay with me, because once you see the full picture, it becomes impossible to unsee. The United States is no longer behaving like a confident empire expanding forward. It is behaving like an empire terrified of losing control. That distinction matters enormously. Confident powers build systems. Declining powers sabotage systems. And what Washington is doing right now all across Eurasia is not construction. It is controlled disruption. The goal is no longer simply to dominate the world through economic superiority because China already shattered that trajectory. The goal now is to prevent the emergence of any stable alternative power center capable of challenging American control. This is why the war in Ukraine was never really about Ukraine. And this is why the confrontation with Iran is not actually about nuclear weapons. And this is why Taiwan is not really about democracy. These are pressure points, strategic pressure points designed to fragment Eurasian integration before it fully matures into an alternative global order capable of bypassing American power. And here's where the situation becomes extremely dangerous, because Washington understands something very few politicians admit publicly. Once Eurasia becomes economically integrated from China to Russia to Iran and eventually into Europe and the global south, American maritime dominance loses much of its leverage. That is the real nightmare in Washington. Not Russian tanks, not Iranian missiles, not even Chinese aircraft carriers. The real fear is a connected Eurasian economic architecture that no longer depends on the United States to function. Think about what that means strategically. For over a century, Anglo-American power depended heavily on controlling maritime trade routes. From the British Empire to the United States, sea power created global leverage. Whoever controlled the oceans controlled commerce. Whoever controlled commerce controlled finance. And whoever controlled finance shaped global politics. This was the foundation of Western dominance for generations. But land connectivity changes the equation completely. Rail networks, pipelines, belt and road infrastructure, direct energy corridors between Russia and China, north-south transport corridors through Iran. These systems bypass maritime choke points controlled by the United States. And once enough countries become integrated through these alternative systems, sanctions lose effectiveness, naval blockades lose leverage, and financial coercion becomes harder sustaining. That is why Washington sees Eurasian integration itself as a strategic threat. And if you thought this was theoretical, look carefully at what the United States has actually been doing over the past 20 years. Every major intervention, every proxy conflict, every sanctions campaign, every color revolution operation, every military buildup, all of it aligns geographically along critical connectivity corridors linking Eurasian powers together. Ukraine sits between Russia and Europe. Iran connects Central Asia to the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. Taiwan sits near critical Pacific maritime routes. Syria sits near Mediterranean access corridors. Afghanistan borders China, Iran, Pakistan, and Central Asia simultaneously. This is not random. These are strategic pressure zones. What Washington fears more than anything is stability across Eurasia, because stability creates integration. Integration creates economic independence. Economic independence weakens dependency on Western-controlled systems. And once enough countries no longer fear Western sanctions or financial punishment, the entire architecture of American global primacy begins weakening rapidly. Now here's the truly terrifying part. The United States understands its relative power position is shrinking over time. That means Washington increasingly operates under what strategists call a closing window mentality. In other words, policymakers believe they must act aggressively now before competitors become too strong later. Historically, this mindset produces extremely dangerous behavior because it encourages escalation before strategic advantages disappear entirely. This is why diplomacy increasingly feels fake. Because for Washington, diplomacy often functions less as conflict resolution and more as strategic positioning. Look at what happened with Russia before Ukraine exploded fully. NATO expansion continued while simultaneously reassuring Moscow there was no hostile intention. Look at what happened with Iran. Negotiations continued while pressure campaigns intensified. Look at Taiwan. Washington officially supports the One China policy, while simultaneously undermining it through military cooperation and political escalation. The pattern is obvious once you recognize it. The United States uses diplomacy to buy time, shape narratives, calm public fears, and position military infrastructure, not necessarily to solve underlying conflicts permanently. And adversaries have learned this lesson. Russia learned it. Iran learned it. China learned it. That's why trust between major powers has collapsed almost completely. And once trust disappears between nuclear powers, the entire international system becomes exponentially more unstable. Now, if you stay with me here, because this next part explains everything, you'll understand why the economic dimension of this confrontation may ultimately matter more than the military one. The United States no longer possesses the industrial dominance it enjoyed after World War II. That era is over. China became the manufacturing center of the world while the West financialized its economy heavily. For decades, American elites believed financial power could permanently substitute for industrial power. But geopolitical conflict exposes the weakness of that assumption very quickly. Wars require production, massive production. Ammunition, drones, semiconductors, steel, energy, rare earth materials, shipbuilding capacity. Industrial depth matters enormously during prolonged strategic competition. And this is exactly where China's rise transformed the global equation. Beijing didn't simply become richer, it became systemically essential to the world economy. That terrified Washington. Because once your primary rival becomes central to global supply chains, containing them becomes extraordinarily difficult without damaging yourself simultaneously. This is the trap American policymakers now face. They cannot fully decouple from China without causing enormous economic pain globally, including inside the United States itself. So, what's the alternative strategy? Controlled chaos. Disrupt trade routes. Weaponize sanctions. Destabilize energy markets. Increase geopolitical risk. Force countries into dependency through insecurity. Slow integration. Create friction everywhere possible. In other words, if Washington cannot maintain uncontested dominance positively, it can still attempt preserving leverage negatively by making the alternative system unstable. And this is exactly what we're seeing in the Middle East right now. The attacks on Iran are not simply about Iran. They affect China's energy security. They affect Asian supply chains. They affect maritime insurance rates. They affect shipping stability from the Persian Gulf through the Indian Ocean. This creates pressure not just on Tehran, but across the entire Eurasian economic ecosystem. Similarly, the war in Ukraine disrupted European-Russian economic integration directly. Nord Stream pipelines destroyed. Energy dependency severed. Trade relationships shattered. Europe forced deeper under American strategic dependence again. This is not coincidence. This is geopolitical engineering through disruption. But if you thought Washington had a coherent path toward victory, here's the problem. This strategy carries catastrophic risks even for the United States itself. Because the American system today is far more fragile internally than most people realize. Debt levels are staggering. Industrial decline weakened resilience. Political polarization is severe, social trust is collapsing, financial markets remain heavily dependent on confidence and dollar dominance, and global instability threatens all of those pillars simultaneously. That means the United States is effectively gambling its own internal stability on preserving external dominance. Historically, that rarely ends well. Empires become most dangerous precisely when they begin sensing irreversible decline. Why? Because elites convince themselves extraordinary risks are justified to preserve the existing order, and that mindset often produces overreach. Look at history carefully. Britain overextended itself repeatedly trying maintaining imperial supremacy. The Soviet Union exhausted itself through unsustainable geopolitical competition. Even Rome eventually reached a point where maintaining the empire became more destructive than beneficial internally. The United States is approaching a similar psychological phase now. And if you think the military dimension isn't escalating accordingly, look at the strategic encirclement architecture forming across Asia. Japan remilitarizing, South Korea integrating more tightly with American command structures, expanded military access in the Philippines, increased naval deployments across the Pacific, Taiwan militarization accelerating, intelligence coordination deepening across allied states. This is containment infrastructure. Washington understands direct invasion of China is impossible. That's not the objective. The objective is strategic pressure from all directions simultaneously. Economic pressure, military pressure, technological pressure, energy pressure, diplomatic pressure, information warfare pressure. The hope is that enough cumulative friction slows China's rise permanently. But here's the flaw in that logic. Pressure often produces counter-coalitions. The harder Washington pushes Russia, China, and Iran simultaneously, the more incentive these countries have coordinating together. And unlike during the Cold War, they possess complementary strengths economically and strategically. Russia possesses enormous natural resources and military capability. China possesses industrial and technological depth. Iran possesses geographic leverage and regional influence across key energy corridors. Combined, they form a strategic bloc far harder containing than any individual power separately. This is why the old divide and conquer strategy no longer works effectively. And perhaps Washington understands this already, which makes the situation even more dangerous. Because if policymakers conclude long-term containment is failing, pressure for direct confrontation increases. Now, publicly, nobody openly talks about world war because the phrase itself terrifies populations. But strategically, we are already inside a global confrontation phase. It simply hasn't fully transitioned into direct large-scale warfare between great powers yet. Proxy wars, sanctions wars, cyber warfare, economic warfare, information warfare, covert operations, political destabilization campaigns, infrastructure sabotage. This is modern great power conflict already unfolding in real time. And if you think escalation stops here, consider the rhetoric emerging increasingly across Western political circles. Nuclear normalization. That's the part people should be paying attention to very carefully. Statements that would have shocked the world 20 years ago are now casually discussed publicly. Conversations about striking Iran. Conversations about direct NATO confrontation with Russia. Discussions about preparing for war with China. Massive military budget expansions. Civil defense discussions returning across Europe. This is not normal rhetoric. It reflects an elite class psychologically preparing populations for prolonged confrontation. And perhaps the most dangerous element of all is that many Western policymakers still appear trapped inside outdated assumptions from the unipolar era. They still behave as though overwhelming pressure automatically forces adversaries into submission eventually. But Russia didn't collapse. Iran didn't collapse. China didn't collapse. Instead, these countries adapted, built alternatives, expanded coordination, increased domestic production, diversified financial systems, developed independent technological ecosystems, and most importantly, they learned how to survive outside full Western approval structures. That changes global politics permanently. Because once countries discover they can resist Western pressure and survive, fear diminishes. And once fear diminishes, deterrence weakens. That is the real strategic crisis Washington faces now. Not simply military competition, not simply economic competition, a credibility crisis. Can the United States still shape the international system according to its preferences? Increasingly, the answer appears uncertain. And uncertainty inside declining empires historically produces instability, not restraint. Now here's the truly alarming part most analysts still underestimate. Technology is accelerating power diffusion faster than traditional empires can control. Drones, AI systems, cyber capabilities, decentralized manufacturing, missile technology. These tools allow regional powers to impose costs on stronger adversaries much more effectively than in previous eras. Iran demonstrated this. Cheap drones threatening extremely expensive systems. Asymmetric warfare neutralizing portions of technological superiority. Infrastructure vulnerability becoming impossible, eliminating entirely. The monopoly on advanced warfare capability is disappearing. And once smaller powers can threaten larger powers credibly, the entire structure of deterrence changes. This is why the next decade may become one of the most unstable periods in modern geopolitical history. The old order is weakening. The new order has not stabilized. And the power currently losing dominance appears unwilling, accepting transition peacefully. That combination is extraordinarily dangerous. Because history shows us something repeatedly. The most volatile moments in international politics happen when rising powers and declining powers collide during periods of systemic transition. That is exactly where we are now. And the frightening reality is that almost every major flashpoint on Earth, Ukraine, Taiwan, Iran, the South China Sea, the Red Sea, NATO expansion, sanctions warfare, all of them are connected pieces of the same larger geopolitical struggle. A struggle over who shapes the 21st century world order. And right now, nobody can confidently say where this confrontation ultimately ends.